Good early, late morning, everyone. I'm Emily I. This is my co-host, Ralph Andrade. We are both part of the ETL team in the recently reorged Action Lab at Ed Plus. I will confess right now, I asked Ralph to co-host before I realized how much information I had to cover. We have about 100 slides up here at the moment. So it's either going to be a lightning fast drive-by or the dedicated ones may be a little late to lunch. This is a brief overview of Alteryx features, functions, tips and tricks, some best practices that we've learned. We basically use this tool every day, and time permitting, there will be Q&A at the end. These are the topics I plan to hopefully cover today. As a brief introduction, primarily we use Alteryx for data cleansing, data preparation, and data transfer. And that's to assist with generating reports, creating visualizations, and maintaining our Ed Plus data mart, which is a subset of tables and views from various sources, mostly the data warehouse, that we've performed various transformations on specific to our reporting and research needs, generally focusing on online students and session level details. Let's do that. So jumping right in, when you launch Alteryx Designer, you're presented with a blank canvas, and you can use that to build a workflow using provided tools. And those are connected at anchor points, which are the tool inputs and outputs. There are a variety of canvas level options for layout. Generally stick with horizontal. I found one use case for a vertical. I have a sample at the end if anybody's interested. It's really kind of a weird format. Annotations are, I find them very helpful, but I know some users find them distracting. There are the options here will control the defaults for all of the tools, but those defaults can be overridden at the individual tool level. Although the setting here is the only way to see the tool numbers, which can help you finding your errors. There is a setting for connection progress that will show you the count of records and the amount of data that's flowing through your workflow when it executes. I will note anchors without downstream tools do not display a progress. User settings, under options, user settings, and edit user settings. I've got a couple of slides on this. The AMP is the new multi-threaded processing engine that I'll cover later, but this is where you set the default. It can be turned on and off for each individual Canvas workflow. There's this option for completion notifications that can be a pop-up window and or a sound that will play. I find I'm constantly running lots of workflows, running long workflows, multitasking, walking away, leaving things running when I leave at the end of the day. So I find this useful that when I come back, I know because the pop-up window is there that that workflow is finished and it gives me some details about it. There's an option for multiple tabs of the same workflow to be open or not. I say, yes, please. Maybe you have a reason you only ever want one copy of something open. So set that accordingly. Canvas settings. So the canvas itself, you can customize. You can set your colors. You can add a grid to the background. You can have your tool snap to the grid. You can size that grid. You can change the zoom, how it retains the last time you were zoomed in or zoomed out at a level, and the connecting line styles. Data connection manager, more on this later, but this is where you enable it if you want to use it. There's an option to display XML in your properties windows. It's just a little thing on your tool properties, and they can be useful. Everything in XML or everything in Alteryx is XML behind the scenes, and it's very useful in Google Sheets. Jason? Maybe, so it's not covering part of the slide. I don't know if we can move that or how to move that. Yeah, that's fine. Sure, no, understandable. And I'll share these slides afterwards. They'll be out there and available. Auto recover, I have more on this on the next slide, but that's something Alteryx has pre-set up, so it will keep temp copies of your workflows every few minutes, whatever you set, and keep them for a number of days. If something were to crash or go wrong, you can get back to some things. There's an option to configure the directory location for macros, so they show up in your ribbon if you're using macros. And then there's a location settings where you can set language, sort order, date formats, like whether you're decimal points, a comma, or a period. So auto recover and backups. Alteryx will save a temporary copy in whatever you've specified, depending on what those settings were. You've got a limited amount of time that you can sort of roll back history if something were to go wrong. And it will keep those for a set number of days and clean them up automatically based on what you've configured. It also creates, when you open a workflow, as soon as you edit and save that, it'll create a backup file, automatically a BAK file in the same directory that that workflow lives, that saves the state prior to the most recent save. So that can be a recovery point for you if you need it. If or when Alteryx crashes, auto recover should pop up automatically. It doesn't always. That's the directory to get to it. File, open window, open auto recovered files if you need to get there for any reason. On your workflow tabs, so how do you tell when you need to save? Well, thankfully, Alteryx will add an asterisk at the end of the workflow name on the tab. Although I've seen it adds an asterisk, I can open a workflow, click in one tool, and it says something's changed, even though I didn't actually change anything. Take it with a grain of salt. But knowing where your workflow lives when you're getting ready to save it can also help. If you hover over the tab name, it will show you the directory path. And based on that, you can figure out whether you opened it locally or opened it from the gallery. If you opened it locally, when you save it, it's going to save back to the same local directory and overwrite that, but you've got your BAK file there in the background for you. If you open it from the gallery and you save it, it will save back to the gallery as a new version unless you rename it, and then it saves it as a second copy on the gallery. If you downloaded it from the gallery, when you do a save, it's going to prompt you as if it was a save as and ask you where you want to save it. You can save that back to the gallery, but it'll be a second copy, even if you save with the same name. There's ways to consolidate those if you need to. Little hint, I've done this more times than I'd like to admit. When I'm saving, I try not to X out of the tabs or X out of Alteryx to close it. When you do that, it will prompt you if you've made any changes to save your workflows. But I have this bad habit of starting to save a workflow and then realizing I want to check 3 more things or change something and canceling out to do that before I actually do the save. If you do that when you've done an X out, it will cancel your changes and close the window. So just be careful. You can use autosave in that case to maybe get back where you were if they were anything important. Some workspace tips, just general workspace, AWS workspaces. You can run multiple instances of Alteryx, which I like to do if I'm doing very different things. I'll have 2 separate Alteryx windows open, and that can also help. I've had cases where something I'm doing keeps crashing it, and I've got another workflow that I want to keep running, so 2 instances are helpful. You can go full screen mode across multiple monitors. I find it very annoying and not personally very useful, but I showed it not too long ago. Somebody asked about it and they went, "Oh, this is amazing." And I went, "Okay." You do have to know how to get back out of it. It can be a challenge. If you're working in Alteryx and it seems like it's running slow, I recommend you do have you tried turning it off and on again, reboot. That will, if you close all your Alteryx windows, save everything, close everything, reopen it, that'll clear out memory and temp space usage, which can occasionally get sort of overrun and pegged down. And there is an option to duplicate a tab when you right click on the tab name. I find that a really great quick way to copy a workflow. It's also useful because when you execute a workflow, you can't do anything in that workflow while it's running. And some of my workflows take hours to run. But if I start something and go, "Oh, I wonder if I did that, or I need to check that thing," I'm not going to remember to do that in 10 minutes when it finishes. So I will sometimes duplicate that workflow. It'll even work on an executing workflow, check what I need to, and then close the duplicate. I have to be careful that I don't start editing that and end up with two divergent copies. And the duplicate tab's a standard browser option on most browsers, which can be helpful in the gallery. So on to the actual tools. There are various inputs and outputs built into Alteryx, some proprietary formats. Your common database connectors are mostly there, basic file formats, your specialty files, your Excels and CSVs and things are there as well. And then some third-party connectors, S3, Google Sheets, Salesforce, and Tableau are some of the ones we use. Database connections, ODBC is great to use. There are predefined ones in your workspaces when it gets configured, and using the server level defined ODBC drivers are your best option if they have what you need. If you have to set up a user defined, that is possible, but you can't share those, so it needs to be set up by everybody on their own. We highly recommend using app IDs. That's something enterprise technology can help you set up. So they're shared accounts and passwords that can be used among your team. And that way, if you open a workflow, you don't have to go reset all the username and passwords to yours because they were a coworker's, and you don't have the passwords. Another option, gallery connections. So within the Alteryx gallery, you can configure connection strings pre-configured. These are great because they persist even when you, we've had issues with pushing things up to the gallery, pulling them back down, and the credentials are just suddenly missing. They've disappeared. The gallery connections seem to persist more so, which is very nice. And the gallery connection configuration, once you set up a gallery connection, you also have to authorize individual users to use that connection. So there is an extra level of security. And another benefit, the passwords are hidden. You don't actually see the password when you use the connection. And if the passwords need changed, you can go change them in one place in the gallery, and all of your workflows are magically updated. So we use those whenever we can. DCM, the data connection manager, new technology. The only thing that requires it right now is a Salesforce tool, and ET hasn't completely implemented it. So I'm not going to go into it in detail. I have gotten it to work locally, but you can't share the local ones. So not super helpful yet. External tool connectivity. Google Sheets, we use Google Sheets in a number of our workflows. There is a fairly simple sign-on process, single sign-on kind of thing. You have to jump through some hoops, but once it's done, it's fairly easy. You will see anything that's in your Google, anything you created in your Google Drive or anything shared with you. Google shared drive files are not visible, but if you pick a random one, you can edit the XML and get those in there too. It's a little bit of a workaround. You can't access Salesforce directly, although I've seen some weird issues depending on your access and the version of the tools you're using. Some things aren't visible. Haven't quite figured all that out yet. And you can access Slack. It's really easy to send an email to Slack from Alteryx. There are ways to set up to actually post directly to Slack, but that requires some additional access configuration. Although we have managed that. If somebody's interested, we could, kind of talk you through that process. The select tool is useful to see for the fields that are in your workflow, to see what those are, to reorder them, to rename them, to update data types and sizes, or to add descriptions. And you can sort and reorder those alphabetically or in the processing order as it's going through the workflow. I find the alphabetical very helpful when I'm trying to compare two sources sometimes. Data types. Alteryx will read data types from its source, and when it does that, especially if it's connecting to a database, it does a pretty good job of getting the data types right. When it has to guess because it can't read them from the source, it doesn't do a very good job, in my opinion. It often chooses random things and very large ones. The standard data types all exist. There's padded and variable strings with single and double byte characters, your common numeric types, date, time, and timestamp functions, and a Boolean, a true, false, basically. With dates, I recommend you think about time zones and formats. You want day, month, year, or month, day, year. Month is a 3-character, a full name, a 2-digit year, a 4-digit year. If you're doing day of week, do you want a short day a week, a medium length day a week, or a full day of week? Time can be 12 or 24-hour formats. You can include or not include time zones. So lots of options there. There is an autofield tool in Alteryx that's supposed to pick data types based on sampling the data, but I found it can often misinterpret. So if you've got a data set that you feed into it and you happen to have all null fields in a 20-character string, it's going to treat it as a Boolean because it didn't know what was there. So it's going to make it as small as possible. Data cleansing and formula tools. So our Alteryx has a data cleansing tool with some really nice built-in functions. It can remove null columns or rows. It can trim white space, punctuation, letters or numbers. It can adjust case. but it does generate a lot of overhead because it applies that to every single field in your data and every single row. So it can be a little slow when you've got one of those in there. We've found in general that if you want to use a formula tool to do just the bits and pieces of that you need, that can be much faster. You could even use multiple formula tools if you need, and that will even run faster than a data cleansing often. And the formula tools themselves are a very powerful way to use code and functions to basically transform your data. I would recommend you watch the data types and sizes, especially if you're outputting a new field. Choose the smallest and most appropriate data type. You can always update it later if you need to. So there's 3 basic formula tools. The standard one, you can only act on one field at a time, but you can't do multiple fields within the same tool. So they're kind of stacked on each other. You can reorder, it executes top to bottom, but you can reorder that because you can actually build a formula and then reference that in a lower formula. So you can actually sort of nest those within a single tool. I recommend you add comments. You can do comments in formulas. And if you're testing a new formula and you're not quite sure you've got it right, I would recommend writing that field to a new column, creating a new field as your output, run it through, compare the old and the new. And then once you're sure it's kind of doing what you think it's going to do, go ahead and set that to overwrite because you really don't want to add the extra fields long-term necessarily, unless you really need it to be a new field for some reason. There's a multi-field formula also. So that applies the same formula across the selected set of fields you choose. You can filter those by data type. You can only do one formula per tool, but it can be can have nested functions, can be complex if then else logic in there. And you can do multiple tools in a row in your canvas. So you could sort of chain those if you need to do multiple things. Again, comment and the thing about new fields, generate them and then check them and reset them. The last one's a multi-row formula. So this works if you're familiar with SQL lead and lag functions. This is essentially Alteryx's version of a SQL lead and lag. You group by a certain subset of your columns, and then within that, you can look at, for a given field, you can look at rows preceding and after the current row of data and write your formulas based on those changes in those records. I highly recommend you sort your data coming in so you sort of have a clue what you're looking at when you get that grouping narrowed down. Again, you can only really do one field change per tool, but you can do multiple tools in your workflow, and the same thing about new fields, testing those. Other transform tools, there's a date time tool to convert to and from, convert date time to strings or convert strings to date time fields, and you specify the format. There's a text to column tool. So if you have a field with delimited data, you can parse that out into multiple columns or rows. There's an XML parse if you happen to have a field with XML in your data. And there's a regex tool that can parse, match, replace, or split text to columns using regular expressions. So that can be very powerful if you're familiar with regular expressions. Filtering and sorting. The filter tool evaluates a formula and then splits the data into true, false. So values that meet the criteria or don't meet the criteria you provided. I use these occasionally to check join results after, or to check results after I've done a join. I did a presentation on that for the Alteryx user group that I've linked here, and it'll be in the presentation at the end too. The sort tool will let you order your data. Basically, it's a SQL order by function or SQL order by clause. And then there's a sampling tool that's very interesting. You can use it sort of like a limit clause in SQL, but it also does some other things. So you can do the first n number, you set the n, however many values you want. You can do first, last, skip the first n values, one of every n, the first n% of value record, or first n% records, or a 1 in n chance to include each row. So you can get some very interesting subsets or selections of data if you want samples for some reason. More filtering and sorting. There's a record ID that'll let you assign a unique value to each row. That can be useful if you're doing a bunch of transformations that are going to rearrange your data possibly, and you want to reorder it into incoming order further down the line. Similarly, there's a tile function, and it does numbers within groups. So you could have group one, based on how you group, you'll have like multiple groups, and within each of those, it will then do orders, and you'll have double sets of numbers that you can additionally reorder things later on, regroup. There's a unique tool which will dedupe data. I find I'm cautious to use it because it will only when you dedupe a record, it'll only look at the fields you selected for uniqueness. So if you have two rows that have similar data in the first three columns, but the last four columns are all different, and you've only done a unique on those first three, it's going to randomly pick one of those two to be unique, and the other one, all the others are going to go to duplicate. If you actually need to like choose uniqueness and not sort of be that random, I will either do a unique on all columns, look for true full duplicate rows, or you can sort of mimic SQL row number functionality with a combination of a sort, a tile, and a sample tool. The summarize tool. So again, you're going to group by a set of fields. And then once you do, you can perform a variety of summaries. Counting, you can count number of records, number of nulls, number of not nulls, number of distinct values, number of not null distinct values, general min max mode first and last. You can do average, percent, median, standard deviation, and variance with or without including zeros. If you're looking at numerics, you can count blank and non-blank for string fields. You can find the longest or shortest. You can concatenate strings, so much like a list ag or a string ag function. And there are some fancy financial calculations if you want to do net present values, rates of return, or if you're working with spatial data, there's some special spatial options as well. The join tool lets you combine two data streams based on common fields or record position. You can adjust the field names and data types within the join tool, but any changes you make there will only apply to the join anchor output. So if you're unioning your results, which you'll need to do if you're sort of mimicking outer joins, SQL outer joins, we recommend doing any column updates in a select after the union. The output anchors will show you your matched joined records. The left anchor will show you mismatched records that came from the left input. The right will show you mismatched ones that came from the right input. That can be very useful to see what's being sort of cast off and not joined. That'll help you find either join condition errors or your join condition wasn't quite right, or data issues you didn't know existed possibly. To limit overhead, however, whenever you can, we recommend you push your joins back into your SQL queries, because pulling all this into Alteryx, it does all this in memory. And if you're processing lots of records, that's a lot of overhead. The other option would be to pull it into Alteryx, do this join, work out all of your kinks and figure out what you want it to be, and then push it back into the SQL query once you sort of understand what's happening. So the union tool, you can combine multiple data streams. It'll auto-configure based on the column names or the column positions. You can manually reorder those and mash columns together however you like. I don't do that very often, but I have had a need for it once or twice. You can order the output streams. So that's just the chunk of data within each output. It's not necessarily in order unless you've ordered that somewhere else in your data stream. And Alteryx will issue a warning for any fields that aren't in all of your data streams going into the union. We recommend there's an option in the union tool itself to set that to an ignore, which is useful because you probably know they're not all going to match and you don't care. And all of those warning messages in your output, if you have too many, can actually overrun the message logs and fail workflows. We've seen it happen. Containers, organize and control your workflow process. You can use this just to disable sections or of tools in your workflow, which is a great way to prevent writes if you're testing. If you've got outputs where you're writing out or something, put it in a container, disable it while you're testing, enable it before you save it. You can also, if you've got a complicated workflow, containerize sections and just collapse them. A collapsed a collapse container will still execute unless it's also disabled. Those are two separate things. And you can label the containers, which is very helpful to kind of organize and help others understand your workflow. I do have some examples later in the documentation section. Results and errors. So when you run a workflow, you'll get output results that usually shows at the bottom of the designer window. You can sort and filter those options by clicking on the 3 vertical dots on next to each column. The results in anchors, if you're looking at a tool and you just look at an anchor output, are often only partial data if you're pulling much data through your workflow. Browse tools will always show you your complete set of results. So if you really want to make sure you're looking at all of your data, make sure you're looking at a browse. There's also some field value breakdowns it will show. So it'll give you like how many different types of values are in this field, and that those are often also partial data, so you can't always trust them. There's also a little line under each column that kind of tells you how many nulls or how much of your data may be, how many of your fields may have issues with them. Sometimes there's leading or trailing spaces and things that'll indicate as well. Those again can sometimes only be partial data. Error messages can be a little cryptic. I recommend Googling them or posting in the Alteryx Slack channel if you can't figure something out. And there is a find and replace option that's great to help you either find errors, because you can search by the tool ID if you didn't turn that on in your annotations. And you can also use it to help find and update fields if you needed to change something or change a table name. Find and replace are great. Your output log, so when you run something, it will list out all of the errors, which are things you obviously probably need to fix. It will show warnings, which you might want to look into. Things like data conversion errors will throw as a warning. Missing fields will throw as a warning. Maybe you knew those were going to be missing and you don't care, and you can reset those. I'll go through how to do that later. And then messages, just things you might want to review. It will, show you the counts of what processed through this tool, how many records were written, how many things were split, what in a true false filter, in a filter, how many went to the true side, how many went to the false side. So you can maybe catch some things there. And if you wrote any outputs like an Excel or a CSV, it will give you the path. And if you click on that path, it will open the file for you. That's a quick way to find your files if you've got something writing out. So optimization, some things to think about when you're building your workflows. Try to minimize processing, remove tools that don't provide benefit. Something like a select maybe isn't doing anything. Maybe you're not making any changes to any fields or adding any benefit, but having it there makes it easier to read and understand what's happening in your workflow. So sometimes those are okay to leave. We recommend limiting the number of records and fields you're processing to only what you need, like avoid select stars, deselect things once they're no longer needed for processing. And again, move joins and filters back into the SQL queries when you can, so Alteryx isn't doing all the processing overhead. Think about the order of tools on your workflow. Sometimes maybe you can reorder things, and it will allow you to, maybe if you reorder a couple things, you can combine some formulas. For instance, maybe you're doing a formula and then a select and then a filter and then another formula. Well, maybe you could move those formulas back and put them all in one formula tool. And if you're running a process anyway, you might want to think about writing out to multiple things at the same time. So one workflow can write to dev, can write to production, can write to an Excel spreadsheet, can write a CSV, can write a Tableau file, all in the same thing. If you're processing the data, push it to wherever you need it in one workflow. Document when you can, and there is a profiling option that'll help you find slow spots. So when you're making changes in a workflow, Alteryx will automatically, if you make a change upstream, it'll adjust the downstream tools. Some of those will show as errors if a field disappeared or a name changed in a filter, for instance, and it no longer recognizes it, it'll show up as an error. But a lot of tools, selects and joins in particular, just show the fields as missing when they change. It could be you change the name, the new name ended up at the bottom of the list, but the old one's wherever it was in the list and it shows as missing. Clear those up. Again, they'll all show as warnings and that can overrun your workflow. And there's a description field option in your select and join tools. I like to use that to document why I deselected particular fields, why they weren't needed anymore. When you're making changes, you do need to check all of your downstream tools. Uniques often will lose if you broke your connection at some point. Your unique tool will often lose all of its configurations. So I like to document when I put a unique tool in what fields I was uniquing on. That could be helpful. Extra tools. So look through your workflow when you're done. Make sure you don't have a bunch of extraneous things that aren't doing anything, or things that you sort of spun off of your main work stream to do some checking or some validation. If you want to leave those in there for future troubleshooting, put them in a container and disable it, label it, disable it. Good way to leave them there, but not have them run and use that processing overhead every time you execute. And again, you might want to leave some like a select tool, even if it's not doing anything, just make it easier to understand. So documentation, I recommend you document thoroughly and often. You'll thank me later. We have connection issues with gallery saves a lot of times. So we like to try to document our credentials when we can. Third-party tools, especially Google Sheets, seems like sometimes they just time out and forget what it was connected to. So I try to recommend documenting those using annotations or comment boxes, whatever makes sense, although don't record the actual passwords and keys, of course. Annotations can help you with reading and understanding your workflow. The default annotations are limited, so sometimes they're not helpful, or they try to put too much and I think they get annoying. You can override those and put whatever you want in as an annotation, but once you do, it no longer auto updates. So catch-22. I think certain tools, it's useful to annotate, like I said, things like unique that lose their information potentially. You can annotate your streamlines. There's a screenshot up there, that one. So coming into my union tool, I actually labeled each of my inputs. And then if I wanted to reorder them in the union tool, that's what it would show me for the reorders, not number 1, 2, 3 randomly. The benefit to annotations is they follow the tools around the canvas. So as you're moving things around, the annotations go with the tool. If you don't use annotations, I recommend you use comment boxes instead, or the combination of both. The comment boxes are more customizable. You can change the size, you can change the color, you can change the text. You can actually even upload a screenshot into a comment box, which is kind of nice, either an image or a screenshot. You can use them to document an entire workflow if you want. I have an example coming up. The negative is they don't move with the tools. So if you're rearranging or adjusting, you've got to sort of play with reordering all of those. And then again, your select and union tools, or your select and join tools have desker fields that I like to use to keep comments and notes and history. And those are really only visible within the tools. In your formulas, filters, and SQL queries, you can do inline comments. They can either be block style, the /*/ slash to start and end, or a double slash, or a double dash in a SQL work as well. I've often found I'll create a formula and then not need it anymore, but I don't want to delete the formula tool and get rid of it. You can't leave it as just a comment. Alteryx will complain if you don't actually have something happening in the formula. So you can actually enter 1 = 1, which is a always true condition, and then leave everything else commented if you want. Sort of a little workaround trick. Color. So you can change the color of your text boxes and your comment boxes and your containers. I like to use that to kind of track if I'm working on a workflow. I'll like put a box around something and make it a certain color, or put a comment box and make it bright red or bright pink, so I remember to go back and look at things before I think I'm done. You can also, again, set background images in the comment boxes. There is an option to add metadata to your workflow. We like to use these to fill out like nuances in the workflow itself, or the data, any external references, additional documentation, anything you need to consider before rerunning it, known dependencies, and ownership or contact information, at least a name. And that info shows up in the gallery under the details if you've added it in there. So here is a sample workflow with comment boxes at the top to kind of explain each section of the tools. You'll see there's some colored comment boxes there. There's a green and a blue. I'm not sure they're showing up very well. To to do specific groups. I think those might be, the colors might be referenced in the comments at the top. And then you'll notice the email outputs all have containers to easily disable them at runtime if you needed to. This was one of my workflows. That was one of Gemma Wallace's workflows I borrowed. This is one of my workflows that's perpetually in process. And you'll see I like to use colors and comment boxes and containers to organize things. And yeah, like all of the ones here are my outputs that I could shut off if I need to. Obviously, I couldn't disable the other containers and actually leave the workflow because it wouldn't run, but bits and pieces as I'm testing, it's an option. Runtime options. So you can cache your data in your workflows. Caching will keep a temporary copy of data in memory or on disk. Alteryx decides which way it's going to do that. And when you rerun, it'll reference that cache file instead of repulling the data, which can really speed up reruns if you're pulling lots of data. You can cache inputs at that tool level, or you can cache a workflow stream to a point in time. Certain tools are cache points. When you right click, there'll be a cache and run workflow option if that's an actual cache point. You can clear the caches if you need to, either manually or if you make any changes to anything that's cached, it'll auto clear off for you on its own. You can clear those, again, clearing them via the menus or updating any tool, it'll just clear if it needs to change them. I have seen caching cause some weird issues. One's a user issue. You know, you forget, you make a change, you go, oh, I need to tweak this other table over here, and you go do that, and then you rerun it and go, well, why didn't that update? Why didn't that pick up my change? Oh, you didn't clear the cache. It didn't repull the data. It's using the same data it pulled last time. The other thing I've seen is out of sync or missing errors on caches, usually just clearing them and rerunning. You test to repull, but it'll clear out the error. And I have seen issues if I'm caching lots of data in a large workflow that can overrun your temp spaces in workspaces. You can cache both inputs and streams simultaneously. Alteryx sort of decides what's getting cached at what level and how to clear them, so it doesn't always work the way you'd like. The runtime tab itself, you can set the number of conversion errors you'd like to show up as warnings. I recommend setting that low. If you had any, you probably want to look into them anyway. So you don't need to know that every record would have been a conversion error. There's an option to set record limits on your inputs. I've never actually used that. Not sure how it works, but it's there. You can tell Alteryx to cancel your workflow if it finds any error. That can be a double-edged sword, because even a minor error might let everything else continue processing. Or if you're doing multiple writes, maybe one write didn't go out. Maybe that's not important, but the rest of everything finished. Use it sparingly as you like. Additional runtime tab options. You can disable your browse tools. We recommend that if you're pushing a workflow to the gallery. There's no reason you can't see the outputs from a gallery run in detail, so it really doesn't matter if you can see the browses. Although if you're troubleshooting, you need to turn those back on, because it won't show you any outputs at all, even in anchors, which are considered browses, even though those aren't browse tools. You can also disable writes, which is a quick way to turn everything off when testing if you don't want a bunch of containers to have to open and close. Just remember to re-enable them before you save it, because I've seen workflows on the gallery that are writes disabled. Not really helpful. Last one on the runtime, the performance profiling option. It will show you the slow spots in your workflow. We recommend using it sparingly. I wouldn't leave it turned on all the time, and I definitely wouldn't leave it turned on for a gallery, but it'll give you a breakdown of which pieces of your workflow are taking the most time. Some of them you expect to take a long time, but not all of them necessarily. The AMP engine, I'm back to here, the multi-threaded processing. So that splits your data into packets, processes them simultaneously on multiple engines instead of simultaneously, so it can run much faster. But we've seen some weird issues if you've got block until done's in your workflow, which is a specialty tool. Sometimes they don't work quite right with the AMP. So if you've got some weird things happening and you've got a block until done, try disabling AMP. We've also seen some weird random errors when AMP's enabled. So if you run a workflow and AMP's on and you get an error, try disabling the AMP first to see if that clears it. Event notifications. So you can set up notifications to alert you when a job runs and or it finishes with or without errors. There's an option to run a command on any of those, which I don't think I've ever used. We tend to just use the email notifications. It will send basically the message log to you in an email format, and you can send those directly to a Slack channel, which we've done for a long time. It's helpful. I'm going to skip the gallery and scheduling section. We'll come back if there's time. Otherwise, Ralph may not get to present. So, last section, the advanced workflows. These are the fancy options for those of you that like to do difficult and complex things. I have one brief slide. Analytic apps is a way to chain workflows. So you can have one workflow kick off another workflow. We did have some of these early on, but found they were really troublesome. You kind of had to know a lot about them just to be able to execute them and troubleshoot them and update them. And oftentimes we found we could do the same thing in a single workflow using some of the other tools. So your turn to talk about macros.
Thank you, Emily. Just one moment, please. So I would like to talk about working with macros and Alteryx. So when we work with macros within Alteryx, I think you need to change your mindset of how you work with Alteryx, because there's certain nuances to keep in mind when you're working with macros. What I'm going to go over is some of the prerequisites of how to successfully work with macros, the different types of macros, macro usage, workflow files with macros in them, how to handle them, how you'd save a file with a macro within it, and how you'd manage a project and productionalize that workflow. So with prerequisites, in order for the a workflow to work successfully, you want to have some Python libraries pre-installed into your user environment, because there's a Python notebook attached to each user's Alteryx application. And within that notebook, there's certain libraries that you can install within Python to have it be ready to handle those macros, because some macros might use certain Python libraries that you don't have installed in your user environment. So it's best practice to start is to install some of these important libraries. Personally, I've recommended Pandas, Paramiko, that's for SFTP kind of stuff, NumPy, Bodo3, which is one of the most important libraries, I think, on this list, and when working with my macros, because Bodo3 library kind of gives you the software development access to AWS environment through Python. And then requests, it's for making HTTP requests to ingest data from the web. Now we'll talk about the different types of macros, starting out with batch macros. So batch macros run multiple times in a workflow and create an output after each run. The macro runs each time for each record, and it outputs a data for each run, just like a for loop. So it gives you ability to loop through records, which is great positive for it. You can apply a logic to a certain range of records, which is great. But then again, when you're using batch macros, you got to realize that you're creating a separate file that is attached to your main workflow. And I'll go over this in more detail. It's very hard to log things when you start using macros. So you really have to put that effort in to get logging out of the macro and into your parent workflow, so it's visible to everyone working with it, or if you're trying to debug it later on. So the next type of macro we have is an iterative macro. Iterative macros, they keep running until a predetermined number of iterations has been met, or until some condition is met. Think of it like a while loop. Condition is true, do X. Again, you can save a lot of time when you perform this on large data sets. The cons, again, are pretty much you're creating a new file within your workflow. logs are very hard to surface, and debugging broken macros in a large workflow can be nearly impossible. So it's very important to make sure you're using macros with the mindset that you need to send logs to the parent workflow, because when you're debugging a workflow that processes millions of records and you're trying to figure out what's wrong, it becomes really challenging to work with Alteryx and macros. So keep that in mind when you're working with or creating any macros in Alteryx. And now lastly, we have standard macros. Standard macros are pretty much a bunch of Alteryx tools packaged together as one workflow or macro. It's great to consolidate large workflows. You can daisy chain a lot of these workflows together and time things. You need one to run at X amount of time and then something else to run right after that. So this is a great way to package, consolidate extremely large workflows. But then there's this downside of, it's very complicated to debug. You don't know where the error necessarily is originating from, or you're creating that external file that people don't really consider when they're working with Alteryx. And standard macros and nested workflows kind of almost the same thing. More often than not, we are working with nested workflows when we introduce a macro into it without even realizing it. It's only visible when you import these workflows or export them, as you can see in the screenshot over here. You have the top parent level workflow, which is the EP term enrollment data, but right under it is an externals folder. Now, this external folders might have subfolders called 1, 2, and within those subfolders is where all these macros reside. So every time you have a workflow that has a macro, think of it as a project, not just one file. You're working with a project that has multiple files and multiple folder substructures within it. Obviously, there's some great benefits to nesting workflows. You can, orchestrate workflows together. You can create timings between workflows where you need something to run first and then another process to run after that process has run, like you're loading a table and you want to make sure the data is present in that table before your next workflow tries to access that data. So stuff like that. It makes your workflows look really clean. Like the next example over here, this is a very clean workflow, but it's a very complicated workflow when you're debugging it, because when this runs, you see all the logs that are available to the parent, but anything that's happening within those blue dots, it's really hard to surface. And you can enable an option that lets you see these logs in your parent workflow, but sometimes it works, it doesn't work, it's just hit or miss. So just keep that in mind. And the downside to working with these nested workflows or standard macros are obviously those multiple files within those external folders. And what happens in the macro often stays in the macro. So it's always hard to document or log these issues when they do arise. So how do you tell if your workflow has a macro or is a macro? Is you go to click on the canvas on a blank piece of the canvas, and on the left side, there's a column that appears. So it is your workflow configuration section, I guess. And within that, on the second tab, there's a workflow tab, and that will describe to you what type of workflow you're working with. There's different options that will appear when you click that drop down for the macro option. That's where your standard iterative batch and location macros will be, and obviously a standard workflow, which is just the ones Emily showed you earlier, just straightforward macros. I mean, workflows that use inbuilt Alteryx tools. Just a note about macro usage. Use caution when implementing macros. Understand the shortcomings that exist when using macros. It will help you work more effectively with macros. They're great tools, I think. You just need to know what you're doing when you're working with macros. ask questions. I'm always ready to help anyone that's using macros, is having a hard time understanding how they work with the workflow. Please let me know. I'll be more than glad to assist you. And just to give you a visual of what that might look like over here. See, every time we include a macro, it adds another workflow to the file associated with that macro. It gets attached to the parent workflow as seen over here. So all these external folders and subfolders contain some of those blue dots I showed you. They're independent workflows, and they are attached to the parent workflow, which is the EP student cat tables workflow right here. And within that, there's another folder structure for the EP student cat tables macros. And you can have a whole workflow as a macro as well. So it gets kind of confusing, because there's a standard work macros that are the workflows that have been converted into macros that may appear as blue dots, or if you can give it a custom logo, icon or logo. And then you have your macros that perform a function like sending out Slack notifications or uploading things to S3 buckets. They might appear in your external subfolders. So just keep that in mind when you're working with macros and Alteryx. Like over here, you see the, oops. So yeah, I've drawn some red lines to point out what those blue dots represent, the child workflows. I'm just calling them child workflows. I'm not sure if that's the official term, but the parent workflow is just everything else that you see on the surface. And you can drill deeper into these by clicking into them, right-clicking into them, and then you can go to the actual macro file, and it pops up another window, which is another workflow in itself. Here's some tips and tricks on saving workflows with macros. Where should you save a file with a macro in it? It just depends. I feel like you cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach with Alteryx. Depending on the nature of your work, using a macro might be beneficial. Sometimes it's just even better to just be straightforward and use the inbuilt tools that Alteryx provides to you. Just to simplify this decision, I've created like a scenario-based approach to deciding where you should save files. And we'll go over workflows open from the gallery, Alteryx server, workflows from save to Dropbox, macros, I call them utility macros because our team uses a lot of functional tools that use macros to do things that extend the functionality of Alteryx, and then nested workflows. So when you open a file from the Alteryx gallery, you're just opening a file. It doesn't exist locally on your computer. Changes are made to the production copy, which is on your server, but there's no way to back up these large changes you're making or fixes. So I recommend not opening files through the Alteryx gallery, especially if they contain macros, because remember the file structure I just mentioned, those don't always get saved when you try to save a workflow that you open from the gallery. If you want to rework a large project, I definitely recommend downloading the workflow and then working with the whole project as a whole workflow as a project versus just treating it like one workflow or one file. Because what happens when you try to save something that you open from the gallery is this. I'm sure you've seen this. These black question marks that lead to nowhere is because this workflow is looking for those macros, but those macros exist on the server. They're not on your local file. So that's why now you have to go back and find these macro files and re-reference them on this workflow. And then you might be able to run it once you reconfigure everything. So that's why I keep this in mind. Like, it's great to open a file and quickly make some changes, but it's not great when you have to rework some large logical process within the workflow. So that's why I recommend downloading the workflow and working with it there in your local. Saving files. I personally like to use Dropbox when I'm working with workflows specifically. They're great for file recovery, makeshift version control. If your department doesn't have any Git or anything like that, Dropbox is a great place to maintain version history of a file. And then if you're treating your workflow as a project, you're maintaining this whole folder that has all the files associated with that project within Dropbox. So any changes you made today will be good for another 30 days. So you can go back to the history of that file and go back to a certain point of time to get some changes you had made yesterday that you're trying to recover today. So with utility macros, the macros that serve a function like Slack outputs, Airtable input and output, S3 upload tools. I always recommend maintaining a dev folder to isolate your changes from production, because the manner in which these macros are saved in our environment, they're readily available. So if you make a change to have a macro that's in production, it will have a ripple effect on all workflows that reference that file. So always create a separate environment to maintain your macros, especially if you're working in FSX, because changes made to these files reflected globally. So any change you make, it'll have effects to downstream processes if you're not considerate about it. Same with the nested macros or standard workflow, standard macros. Changes are reflected globally. So pull out the changes you need to make into a dev folder of sorts, and then apply those changes, reintroduce them, almost like a branching strategy with Git, but you're using folders and files to achieve that. So another warning, making any modifications to macros or workflows that are connected to live production copies could have major unintended consequences downstream. Hence, use caution when you're working with FSX specifically, because it is a network drive and it's connected. So every computer that accesses that drive looks at it like a local drive. So any processes that use files that are in FSX that are in production, be cautious of making changes to them, because you are changing something that will have an effect on a lot of things simultaneously. And when I'm talking about a branching strategy, I'm not talking about Git necessarily here, but I'm talking about a more simpler approach, something like a simple organized file structure for your team. So you have all this, agreed upon a system, like, hey, we want to save our production workflows in a production folder. Any dev work we're going to do it in dev folder separate from production. That way, any changes you're introducing on the fly are not affecting your production environment or any processes actively running. It does require team consensus. So, you have to get everyone together to agree to work like this. It's not something you can do alone, because when you're working in a team, it's really hard to achieve that end goal. We're going to talk about just managing projects and productionalizing workflows here real quickly. So like I'm stressing this quite a bit here, but to avoid opening files from the gallery that contain macros, they will break when you try to save them. So always download a copy of the workflow and then rework your changes on your downloaded copy in your dev folder. Some of the steps I take while I manage my Alteryx projects or workflows is I initially start out by downloading the work from the gallery. I open the packaged file in Alteryx and I do a save as into a well-organized folder structure. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Once I unzip that folder, it creates that whole project file for me with that top level folder of the project and with all the associated macros within that project. See, this is where you start, you've unzipped the folder, you've created your changes. You make your changes to the copy that you've downloaded, add a change log to your workflow. And in the gallery, instead of uploading that workflow, you just replace the package with the changes made to the local file. That way, any changes you've made, they get carried on, and you have a local copy as well that helps you maintain what changes you've made that are in the production environment. So starting with downloading and saving a workflow, if a workflow is already in production, you're going to just download the workflow. And what you're doing is downloading the whole project. So any file, any macro associated with it, standard macro gets attached to that as a package, and you're downloading a whole package as seen in the screenshot over here. So when you double click on that packaged file, it's going to prompt you to, do you want to import this package into Alteryx? So once you do that, you're going to have this unzipped. You're going to import it into your Dropbox FSX, and you're going to make changes to your downloaded copy. Here, you're going to, make your rework, do all your rework, keeping all these changes in your local copy will help you work efficiently because, you have all your changes here. You're not pushing it. You're not making changes on an open file, saving it and pushing it out to have those changes not be saved anywhere. And lastly, just make sure you're adding a workflow change log to this process, because when you do this, you're not able to retain any comments when you push your workflows to the gallery. So I've created this method where you're just taking an input text and a browse tool to maintain a work log within the workflow you're working with. After you do that, you're going to just upload this copy, your dev copy, to the server, and just have it ready for the next step, which is pretty much going to be you replacing that over here. So you click the three dots over here and you see the replace workflow option. You're going to click that, enter the name that you've given it to dev copy of that workflow, and then you're going to just replace that existing server copy with your dev copy. Just going over schedule creation here quickly is, you don't want to create multiple schedules. If there's a workflow already in your gallery, just use that existing schedule to make any changes, make any edits, and then you can schedule the cadence on that scheduled workflow. What you're trying to do is avoid the clutter in the gallery, because when each workflow can have multiple schedules. So keep that in mind when you're working with the scheduler. There's different ways you can schedule data. Just consider how often the tables get refreshed. Can you offload your workflow to be scheduled on weekends? Do you need to run your workflow 7 days a week? Or consider running your workflow during business week or only during the weekends? Naming conventions with schedules, just keep it simple. Name it after the workflow so you're not creating multiple copies, and it'll make life easier for everyone that uses the Alteryx gallery. And with schedule cleanups, you just clean up your schedules, prevent confusion. It helps you save time, and it always keeping that gallery clean. And lastly, I would say, we want to do our part when we work with shared resources and environments. I think we can talk about best practices all day, but I think it all takes each one of us to be responsible to make this work for everyone else. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Any questions, comments, or concerns?
That slide is an extra stuff on it, which will be the next one.
That's it.
Oh, I must have not cleared that slide to the back. Okay, no,
All right.
don't worry about it. I probably left it hidden. It'll be in the final one.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. All right.